So nice to be with everyone tonight. Thanks for showing up. Let's do what we can to settle in for our meditation time. Composing the body, dropping any idealistic sense of how the body should be, but we're actually working with the body that's here tonight, all of its qualities. So composure really means harmonizing or making peace with the body that's here. So all of our adjustments now, as we find that posture that feels appropriate, just comes out of this harmonizing or paying attention to the body because we care. Respecting the nature and limitations of the body. And we do our best to trust a relative stillness in our sitting posture. Eyes can be open or lightly closed. This sense now that we're right in the middle of all of these activities, sounds and sights and touches, sensations from the most subtle to the most obvious, all the thoughts, mental images, emotions, all of these activities of body and mind, giving them permission to move, which they'll do anyway, right? The body and the mind moves. It unfolds lawfully. And really the only question is, are we willing to embrace the natural sensitivity that comes with being human, comes with having a body and the mind? Can we be sensitive without habits of defensiveness, habits of distractedness, or habits of needing to control, needing to fix? Instead, can we be soft, open, receptive, even vulnerable to what's coming and going now? To really be free, we need to be willing to be touched by what's moving now. Not afraid to feel what we're feeling. So when I say being touched, it might be that we're opening, receiving the experience of numbness. So we're touched by the way it is, not any ideas we have about how it is or how we think it should be. And on the one hand, there's a deepening trust in letting things be the way they are, not imposing any agenda, not in need of an expectation. And on the other hand, we're learning to trust this quality of metta, loving kindness, this goodness of the heart, this generous goodness or goodwill of the heart. And they actually both work together, the letting go, the dispassion, and the kindness and compassion. They really go hand in hand. So just alternate between these two basic themes, wholesome qualities on the path, the quality of tenderness and kindness, goodwill, and the quality of letting go, non-attachment, dispassion, equanimity. The tenderness, the kindness allows the heart to be close, to be touched, as if we're saying, yes, it's like this now. The sitting body is like this. The qualities of my heart are like this now. Can this be okay? And the deepening trust and non-attachment and dispassion is this not trying to make anything, not trying to hold anything, not trying to get anywhere. As if the intimacy of this kind presence is its own reward. What a relief it is not to have to own anything or get somewhere, become someone. What a relief that is. See if you can sense that relief of dispassion, the taste of freedom. All in the context of kindness and compassion, tenderness, because we care about this moment, care enough to say yes, to feel, to be touched by what's moving. So we're going to continue now in silence for most of the rest of the set. And again, just as you practice the way you usually practice, just consider this attitude of tenderness and kindness, how natural it can be, how trustworthy it is. Consider the attitude of dispassion, not holding, non-attachment, and how trustworthy that is, and how they work together. They're not opposites. So take a moment and stretch your body a little if you'd like. So I've just put in the chat, as many of you know, a Google Doc that has some resources related to the talk tonight and other things just about the weekly practice groups. Also a way to support the center and myself, the teacher. So check that out if you want. I've been thinking lately, had a few discussions with folks during a retreat that I led this last week out at Common Grounds Retreat Center around the intersection of this theme in our practice of loving kindness, the generosity of our heart, the goodwill. And it's pretty easy to understand when we experience the quality of metta, loving kindness, goodwill. It's pretty easy to understand this is a wholesome quality, that it makes sense really at any time in our life, any situation we're in the same way that ill will does not make sense, that ill will is seen to hurt. It hurts when our mind is, entangled with ill will. And I think to some degree the same can be said around dispassion, that quality of wisdom that understands it just doesn't make sense to get attached, to take things personally. But the interesting question I think in practice is feeling how the two qualities of loving kindness, metta, and dispassion, letting go, how they really support each other. So I want to talk about that a little tonight. And we probably can sense that loving kindness or that generosity of the heart without non-attachment, well, that's not really metta. It's, love with attachment is a kind of greed, or it's not spiritual love. Like I'll love you if you treat me a certain way. And letting go or non-attachment without the intimacy of kindness is more, it's more like a philosophical non-attachment. We really need that intimacy for non-attachment to be significant. Or you could say we need engagement. Engagement without attachment is really amazing. To be all in but not attached, to be showing up, to be doing what needs to be done, to be saying what needs to be said, but not being attached. That's really a beautiful, impressive quality that we can aspire to. But the kind of non-attachment that's really about being disconnected, like I'm not attached about what's going on over there because that's their business, and it's, I'm not really connected to it, and I don't care enough to be connected to it. That's not non-attachment. That would be a kind of indifference or even aversion. And sometimes people talk about engaged Buddhism as if it's a special kind of Buddhism or something, but I think it's probably more helpful to understand that any authentic spiritual practice has to have this quality of engagement, of being intimate, of even, I think it might be useful to think of it as a kind of vulnerability, like that willingness to be touched by experience, to be touched by life. That's sort of a given. And I think it's a good way to think about all of the complications in life. Sometimes because it is useful, like in our morning sit, it is useful to sit in a place that's relatively quiet. Or if you're fortunate, it is useful to go on a retreat where you don't have a lot of responsibilities for a couple weeks or a few days, whatever can be arranged. And you're in a relatively quiet place without a lot of duties and responsibilities. That's nice. It really supports the practice. But it's not so much about the way to live. Not that we have to go looking for responsibilities or looking for entanglements, but in a way, those places in life where we are, where we do have responsibilities and we are engaged and we are interacting with others, that's where the quality of freedom, that's where we see whether we've developed some freedom in life or not, some freedom in our practice, I should say, or not. Like, I think it was Jack Kornfield that originally said, you think your practice is going well? Well, go home and visit your parents, or something like that. Because there's something about these karmic tendencies we have, and these karmic relationships that we have, and that bring out our own conditioning, our own habits of our personality. And the question is, can we be free? Can we be kind and free when my personality is reacting in this way, when I'm getting triggered in that way? That's really the test. Thich Nhat Hanh, who is in some ways a real master of talking about what some people might call engaged Buddhism, but just useful teachings, dharma, the way it is, helping us kind of align, harmonize with the way it is. Because human beings, an embodied life is an engaged life. And he said once, mindfulness must be engaged. Once there is seeing, there must be action. And then an even more pithy phrase from Thich Nhat Hanh was, compassion is a verb. And one of my all-time favorites, just from a Chan master back in the 9th century. Chan is the precursor to what is now called Zen. It arose in China, kind of a sort of a reform movement of Buddhism in China after Buddhism had been in China for many centuries, and then spread to Japan and Korea and a few other places. And so Yu Min was one of those well-known teachers back in the 9th century. And I think it was his teacher, sort of just to test his own understanding, asked him, what did the Buddha teach all his life? Some question like that. And he had this really simple and I think very deep answer. He said, an appropriate response. And I think that phrase, an appropriate response, is actually a good definition of how we could translate the word Sangha. Right? Somebody who is Sangha, that, enlightened action, awakened action, right? The way we know it is they are open, their heart is open, their mind is clear, both in the sense of the subtlety of what's going on and the breadth, the context of what's happening in the moment. And so how they think and how they speak and how they act would be naturally, organically coming out of that breadth and depth of connection. So it would be an appropriate response. And the tendency to be separating out because of ill will or because of attachment would have been uprooted in that mind, an awakened mind, so that it would have been a very natural, organic arising of an appropriate response, not somebody fretting, like, what's the appropriate response in this situation? And we learn that just even as non-enlightened beings, we slowly learn that the best way to handle a tricky situation, tricky interaction in our life, isn't to try to figure out or isn't to try to really want not to mess up. It's really about being relaxed and being clear and removing any obstacles so that we're really there when we're there, and what we think and say and do will come out of that intimacy, the absence of ill will, the absence of attachments. Doesn't mean that what we do or think or say is perfect. It just means that's the way to practice, practice the appropriate response. It's more about abandoning what's extra and not helpful than it is about trying to respond perfectly, trying to be the great Buddhist master who does the appropriate response, right? That generally gets pretty stinky pretty fast. So, I think we can, starting with the understanding that it isn't easy being a human being, that having a conditioned mind, living in a conditioned world, that is unfolding conditionally, lawfully, due to the enormity and complex unfolding of causes and conditions, what actually helps? And I chose these two, that just comes right out of the tradition, this quality of metta, or really all four of the divine abodes of loving kindness or goodwill, compassion as the second, appreciative joy, mudita, the third, and equanimity, upekkha. So these are the four divine abodes, the four qualities of love, the four attitudes that really are the emotions, only attitudes or emotions we need to be a happy, effective human being. So we have this theme, it's like an intervention or something, a refuge that we can trust. Kindness is something we can trust. And of course we have to learn that it's trustworthy. And we have to, each of us in our own way, we have to tease out our romantic or idealistic ideas about loving kindness, about metta, so that we really understand. And I love this about early Buddhism, that metta is really about the absence of ill will, not Mark kind of being this radiantly loving being, but a practitioner who has seen over and over again that ill will hurts, that ill will doesn't help, and has done the work of learning how not to feed it and how not to just take any of those pathways back to relating with aversion, relating with fear, relating with even anxiety or boredom, for sure not relating with hate and anger. And then the other powerful, useful intervention that, again, just in our ordinary practice, we really learn to trust, which is what we would call non-attachment or dispassion. There's a word in early Buddhism, it's like a big deal word, nibbida, M-I-B-B-I-D-A, and it, gets translated sometimes, especially when they were first translating the suttas into English, and I don't think they had necessarily a deep understanding. It often would get translated as disgust. Like one line was utter disgust for the aggregates. The aggregates are the activities of body and mind, right? So this, my life, is the activity of body and mind, and it's as if the Buddha is saying we should cultivate an utter disgust for these activities of body and mind. Well, most of us would be kind of suspicious of a teaching like that. Like, did the Buddha really teach that? Like, I thought disgust is disgusting. And then other places, this is from an article that's in the document I'm putting in the chat by Andy Olensky, who was for many years the executive director and senior scholar at the Berry Center for Buddhist Studies, and still does a lot of teaching through Tricycle mostly, and he has his own website that's quite nice. You can look him up. But he had an article that you can read in the link to in the document in the chat called "What is Nibbida? Nibbida as Defined" by Andy Olensky. And so it's this word that, like I said, sometimes got translated as disgust. Another person translated as revulsion towards the aggregates, or one turns away from the aggregates, the activities of the body and the mind. And then Nyanamoli, a very well-known translator who was a monk in Sri Lanka, a Westerner who went to Sri Lanka maybe back in the 50s, somewhere around there, and ordained, translated this passage: when one sees it thus, as it actually is, with proper wisdom, one becomes disenchanted with the aggregates. So disenchanted instead of utter disgust. So Andy in this article sort of he's a scholar, Pali scholar, breaks it down and says technically the word should be defined as without, or translated as without finding, right? So in terms of sense experience, one engages the sense experience of seeing a sight, or hearing a sound, or tasting a taste, or smelling a smell, or feeling a touch. One engages it, but never finds what one is seeking in that sense experience. And what do we seek in sense experience? We seek some kind of satisfaction. I'm in a beautiful place in northern Wisconsin looking out at Lake Superior, and been trying to see the ferry going out to Madeline Island. I'm near the Apostle Islands, and and it's just that the way the light catches the water and the clouds, and it's just all the different just shadings, and the ice on the lake is still there in parts, and yeah, it's really nice looking for the ferry going back and forth, and I can observe my mind relating to the visual experience as if I'm trying to get something from it, trying to get some satisfying experience from the visual, looking out toward the lake, or eating food, trying to get some satisfaction, or from sitting in a comfortable way, trying to get some satisfaction. That is sort of the ordinary way we humans relate to sense experience. We're seeking satisfaction from them, which is why, we could say that being a human being is a restless experience. Because although we seek satisfaction from our sense experiences, we don't really find anything but a very ephemeral satisfaction. We do find something, right? When I see a beautiful sight, it is something. When I hear a beautiful sound, when I taste a beautiful taste, it's something, but it isn't something I can actually grasp and own and hold, right? That's what makes it restless. It's there, but it's like sand through the fingers. It doesn't last in a way that's satisfying our nice experiences. There are nice experiences, but they're not really capable of satisfying in the way that we want to be satisfied. So this disenchantment in the story that's told in different ways from the suttas about a dog coming across a bone that has really no flesh whatsoever on it, maybe even dried out, maybe no marrow in the middle of it, and yet the dog sees the bone and gets activated, like maybe there's something there. So he goes at it, chewing, until he finds there's nothing there, without finding anything that is ultimately satisfying. So he leaves the bone with disgust, you could even say, or disenchanted with that bone, right? You're not going to deliver what I was hoping you would deliver. And the dog leaves the bone until another dog comes by hoping to find something on that bone, right? And so that's the simile that the Buddha, I believe, used, but somebody in the early discourses uses to make this point about disenchantment. So how does, if that's part of the process of waking up, paying attention in this balanced, kind way, how does that, everything from utter disgust to disenchantment, how does that square or make sense with a heart that is also learning to say yes with this quality of loving kindness and goodwill? Yes, it's like this. Yes, this experience belongs, you belong. Even when we run into the rattlesnakes in our life, it's not like we want to be close to the rattlesnakes, of course, but we don't throw them out of our heart. It's like there really is that feeling you belong too, and somehow we're going to navigate our space together. I'm going to keep my distance. I'm not going to hang out with you, but I'm not going to throw you out of my heart. And I'm going to protect myself so I don't have to be afraid of you, so I can really feel like you do belong here. And if we do accidentally run into each other, I'm not going to hate you, but I'm definitely going to keep from letting you bite me. Right? And one of us might get harmed because that's how it is on this planet. You know, we are bumping up against each other, and we do have different agendas. You know, we need to eat. Right? We're on a planet where life eats life. It's kind of a setup. And so how does dispassion, letting go of attachment, and compassion and loving kindness, how do they work together? Can they work together? And I mentioned, loving kindness is really this capacity of yes, not throwing anyone out of our heart. And no longer believing that ill will is functional. And the thing is, it's so hard to cultivate a heart of goodwill because our ill will has provided so much meaning in our lives. It shapes our lives, it shapes our relationships with other people. It's just like kind of the fear and aversion is to a large degree the glue of society, of culture. What we hate, what we're afraid of. Like just, when you think about human culture around death, which generally humans have been afraid of, the great mystery of death, and yet it's so rich in terms of just how in culture and community we have done this dance around death and told stories around it and created rituals around it. And to cultivate an attitude that is free of ill will, willing to say yes. And you can see how, they talk about it in the tradition. Loving kindness is really that is by definition without attachment, without clinging. It's that, one of the images I believe the Buddha used was parents who have raised a child, and in the early years, of course, that strong attachment to protecting the child, to hovering and always having your eye on what the child is up to is one thing, but by the time they're an adult, it's just not appropriate. And at some point, hopefully it's a gradual process, the parent has to let go of that responsibility to protect and really let the child, who's no longer a child, make their own choices, suffer the consequences of the choices they're making. And just to, as a metaphor for all of us, we have to do this with every aspect of life, that we love, we care, we feel, and yet so much of what's unfolding we don't control. We just have to allow it to be, like the weather, you know. We can love the earth and the planet, but we don't get to control the weather. Or we don't get to control, the arising of earthquakes or so many other natural processes on the planet. Infestations, First, when I was a kid, our whole city in Minneapolis had pretty large elm trees. And then, of course, Dutch elm disease rolled through. I forget when it first started to come in, but maybe the 70s or 80s. And, now every once in a while, you see one of the old elm trees on the boulevards that were planted back maybe in the 30s. I'm not sure when they were originally planted. But most of them are gone. And now the same thing with the ash trees. There's an infestation, and the emerald ash disease is taking away most of the ash trees, which is another one of our boulevard trees. So it's just sort of these things that we could easily fall into ill will around. But metta doesn't discriminate, doesn't say, well, you belong in my heart, but you don't belong in my heart. And that's the thing about metta as a spiritual love, as opposed to, a more ordinary level of love, which comes with attachment. It really has this quality of non-attachment, non-clinging. Right? So it's sort of strange to think of love with that dispassion. Because it's not about, the thing about metta as a quality we're cultivating, it isn't about the object that we love. It's about the love, it's about the yes itself. The intimacy, the inclusivity with the way it is. It's that, not what we're including, but that we're including, that we're saying yes. That's what makes metta metta, is that not non-discrimination. And then the same thing, like looking how dispassion and non-attachment is really informed by metta. I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but I'll just go in a little bit more depth. And just how we really need this embodied situation we find ourselves in, where we have a body and we have sexuality and we have hunger and we get cold and we have all the, and as a mammal, we generally work in groups. We have to interact and we have to have hierarchy and how we fit in with each other, how we relate to each other. It gets complicated fast. So when we think about dispassion in the context of how entangled our lives are, as humans, as mammals, as an animal, then it's really interesting because, we have this profound instinct to survive, right? This is our animal legacy, right? And yet we're understanding spiritually the trustworthy quality of non-attachment. So it seems like a real setup, like, oh, non-attachment doesn't really make sense for an animal. When so many of our instincts and our conditioning is about survival, and then we're cultivating this trust in this dispassion, this non-attachment, this letting go, non-clinging, the heart that doesn't grasp. So this the metta piece, the way I think it really informs non-attachment, is it metta really makes us feel safe being engaged, being embedded, being entangled in our lives. And that's the only place we can discover non-attachment, right in the tangle. Because the non-attachment, where it gets to be the shadow of non-attachment, which is aversion to life, aversion to entanglements, aversion to duties and responsibilities, right? It's like that proverbial get me to a cave somewhere on the side of a mountain where no one will bother me, But it doesn't really work that way, even though that can be a nice thing to do. We can learn a lot from that secluded experience. Even there, we're still an animal with the instinct to survive, who needs to eat and breathe and urinate and everything else. It's just, relatively simple. But we're still completely part of, the networks of life. So what metta does is it helps us understand that that dispassion can't be about ill will, can't be about fear of responsibility or fear of our heart being touched or moved by what we see, by what we experience. Like that dispassion involves being fully human, not rejecting our humanness. That's what makes dispassion such a beautiful spiritual quality, is actually it's in the direction of being more fully human. Just like metta, we understand it better with loving kindness, how that is a flowering of what we normally would mean to be human, these sort of qualities of love. But it's just as important to understand that in terms of the quality of dispassion and non-attachment, that not taking things personally is also a way for our humanness to really flower. We already sort of know this when we think about people who are, just great leaders, or like in Yiddish, what we mean by the word mensch. Maybe some of you know that term, but just somebody who's has the whole community in mind. And we sometimes use the word sacrifice, willing to sacrifice their own well-being for the well-being of the community, something like that. Even the Buddhist life is a bit of an example of that. I don't know if people remember, and who knows how it really played out, but just even as teachings, it's useful that after the Buddha's awakening for some 45 days or so, he spent some time around the place where he had his deep awakening and contemplated whether he could share this in a way that would be helpful to other people, and was evidently inclined not to share it because he thought it would be troublesome and no one would get it anyway. It's too subtle, this path of letting go, this path of non-attachment, of going beyond the habits of personalizing our experience, and then was encouraged to teach, and then started to contemplate, well, who might be able to hear this, and then went off and looking for some old Dharma friends of his to teach, to share what he had come to understand. But that inclination to not be involved in the world, and to somehow, just in the example, the Buddha taught tirelessly, at least as things seem to be recorded, for 45 years. Living out, people really adored him. They would have, his students or whatever, would have been very happy to, build a nice house for him and give him all the nice things. But he just lived outside mostly with the other nuns and monks, and traveled around so that the word would spread, the teachings would spread. His advice to the early students of his who had also deep insight was, go in different directions. Don't take the same road. So you're going to run into more people that way and share the teachings with more people that way, right? So it was really an act of generosity and engagement. And also he set up the monastic sangha for the nuns and monks. They couldn't store food. They had to be connected with the lay people, created this beautiful synergy where lay people would feed and shelter the nuns and monks. And the nuns and monks, they'd get to be part of their life in that way. And the nuns and monks would share what they could share and be spiritual advisors for the lay people and modeled a life that the lay people couldn't live because they had to feed their kids and take care of the responsibilities that come with a lay life. But there was this sort of, almost like our cells in our body work together harmoniously, right, to make something happen in a sort of nicely tuned community. Spiritual seekers would live together with people who are living more worldly lives, but supporting each other in this sort of way. And I think that can help us understand the intersection of the harmonizing of love and dispassion. But ultimately, we just have to find it ourselves in our own lives by being interested in both of those spiritual qualities in the Dharma, the letting go, the non-attachment, and the metta, the compassion. Develop our own trust. It's easy to think, that Buddhism, it's like a shadow that gets brought up quite often, is somehow about passivity. That even at a time when the Buddha was alive, some general, some military leader said to the Buddha, seems like what you're teaching is mere passivity. And the Buddha had this very simple answer. He said, I teach activity in terms of what's wholesome, and I teach inactivity in terms of what's unwholesome. So when there are wholesome motivations or intentions, then one's heart should just allow those motivations, those intentions to lead into action, to thoughts and words and deeds. And when the motivations are understood to be unwholesome, like greed or hatred, then one would refrain from those impulses, those intentions. Let me read a little before I open it up for conversation. I'll read a little from Sharon Salzberg. She has a wonderful book, if you haven't seen it. It's been around for quite a long time now. A Heart as Wide as the World. I really think it's a gem. And this is page 46 and 47. And it's a short chapter on attachment. And she's giving this funny example. A long time ago, the Dalai Lama visited the monastery where Thomas Merton had stayed, Gethsemane, I think it's in Kentucky. And these Trappist monks, they made cheese and they made fruitcakes to sort of sustain the Catholic monastery. And they gave some Buddhists, including the Dalai Lama, a tour. I think Sharon and Joseph were there. And they gave the Dalai Lama some cheese, but all along through the tour, he really wanted the fruitcake. So he was just sharing this example of that attachment of the fruitcake. And Sharon's sort of sharing the story and then writes, "It is wonderful to get what we want, and we are fortunate when the fruitcake is offered and we can enjoy it. But when we want something out of an effort to fill an aching desire within, looking for some sense of completion, then we are lost in attachment." Right? So that's that idea that a sense experience can be satisfying in some sort of lasting way. And she continues, "We are trying to fill an emptiness that no object can ever fill. Something such as pure awareness or deep compassion might fill it, but not any ephemeral object. And then a little later writes, one of the amazing things about the mind is that it can become attached to anything. We can be attached to a feeling of calm, or we can be attached to intensity. We can be attached to crisis, catharsis, stupor, to anything. We can think we desperately need whatever is the object of our attachment in order to feel alive, to feel complete. The tremendous irony of attachment is that we become lost in this state of mind precisely because we want to feel connected rather than separate and isolated. We mistakenly believe that holding on will reinforce connection, renewing and deepening it. Yet life itself is change. We may struggle in defiance against this fundamental truth of impermanence. We may repair or remove or replace objects as we try to sustain happiness, or try to convince ourselves that we are connected as we reach out to the next passing thing. But the happiness of true connection will remain out of reach. And then again, I'm skipping some paragraph. How do we work skillfully with attachment? Our tendency is to focus so strongly on the object of our attachments that we disregard the feeling of attachment itself. The bright lights are so distracting, so entrancing, that we get drawn in without noticing the tone of the attachment that we are experiencing. When we directly experience the feeling of attachment, we stop being so infatuated with it and we break the trance. When we see the pain of attachment in its naked form, we stop allowing it to rule our lives and diminish our capacity for enjoyment and connection. So this is our courageous path, and there's a real similarity to the deepening trust in loving kindness and the deepening trust in non-attachment, because it's really seen directly in our experience. Some version of ill will hurts, attachment hurts. That even though I'm really trying to take care of myself by doubling down on ill will or fear, I'm trying to make myself safe by being afraid, by being hateful, or by clinging, by getting attached. But when I'm honest, when I'm really sensitive, when I've developed the samadhi to be sensitive, right? Samadhi feels good, but the real reason we cultivate samadhi, that momentum, that continuity, that power of presence, is because we become really sensitive and it becomes obvious. Ill will, attachment is not the way. We abandon attachment and ill will only when we see clearly, directly, in the moment, this cannot be the way. In the same way that dog realized in the moment, there is nothing here for me. There is no meat on this bone. There is no reason to keep chewing, to keep being attached, to keep being afraid. Love is the way, non-attachment is the way. So I'll leave it here. It'd be nice to hear from some of you. Questions, of course, but also your own learnings in your life, contemplating love, seeing the limitations of ill will, contemplating this dispassionate way of relating to sense experience, seeing that attachment, taking things personally is not the way. Yeah, so what comes to mind? Of course, you can just unmute yourself. Always nice to share your first name, where you're coming from. You could also share your pronouns if you want. Looks like Kathy Lynn wants to go.
Hi, Mark.
Hi.
Okay, I'm going to share a positive instead of a negative. So you know a little bit about my history with my ex-husband, 26 years ago or 23 years ago. And just to catch these people up, at one point, Mark suggested that I bow down to the box of writing that I had in my garage about my ex and about raising my son alone as a result of not being with my ex. And I just couldn't really get to not harboring ill will, even though like I wasn't vengeful. It was still something very dark there. And recently I had this experience of we've reconnected. I mean, we're just talking and things as much as you can talk when you're in a different country, but the experience of the impact of my ill will and my lack of forgiveness and my unwillingness to let go, that attachment that I had. And there was like this huge softening in my heart. It was really powerful experience for me around being able to like really let go at a whole new level for me. And then experiencing sort of the remorse around the impact of not letting go and how much I drove a story, you know, when really I was just hurt, you know. Um, and some things weren't like his fault. Not everything was his fault. Like there was a really difficult birth, and there was trauma and just different things. Anyway, it's very interesting. Um, about that uh, like letting go of the ill will so that something else can come in. Um, and I really appreciate that. I just wanted to say that, and I would have never thought that that would have been possible, but it's not a trying thing that happened. It just
Yeah.
kind of happened and evolved over time. Um, so I'm not bowing down to the box anymore. But meantime, there's, like other places in my life where it's like, okay, I want to let you in, but, I really don't want to be around you at all because, it hurts. Like, I don't know how to be with that. I'm not talking about him now, but it's like how to go from that. Like, I really want to let you in with all this legal stuff and this enmity you're having with these other people, say somebody close to me. But I don't want to get involved in the story. I'm still not able to hold the steady meta, so how do you do that? How do you aspire to do that? You'll probably just say keep practicing. But, and also on that note, how do you live like with a serious disease and allow it to be in, like allow it, but not, it gets a little confusing to me.
Yeah. But the metta also gets extended to ourself too. So, as we open to that person and want to let them in, want not to have to keep throwing them out of our heart, we also want to keep ourselves safe. That's part of the metta. Like, I don't want to throw you out of my heart, and turning to ourselves, and I want you to be safe, Mark. I want you to be safe. So when I say yes to you, I'm not going to do something that is putting myself in harm's way. Same thing with with disease and illness. I'm going to do whatever I can. I'm not going to hate that we human beings have bodies that are fragile and vulnerable to all kinds of stuff. I'm not going to demonize that or imagine it shouldn't be this way, because this is how it is, having a body. All kinds of stuff happens. And I'm going to I'm not afraid of that part of me that is fiercely wanting to live and not die, fiercely wanting to be healthy. Like, they don't have to, we can make peace with our vulnerability and still allow that part of ourselves that wants to survive, be? They can, why can't they harmonize? Can they harmonize? So just to be curious, like maybe all those seemingly conflicting forces can harmonize. Thanks for getting us started, Kathy Lynn.
Thank you.
Who'd like to go next? Learnings from your life, like Kathy Lynn shared. It's always great to hear these places of great healing from our practice. Ways you felt. Go ahead, Mamie.
Oh, I'm just it's sweet. I haven't thought of this story of mine in the framing of metta before, but that's exactly what it was. And it's just a helpful support to me in this moment. But I used to teach mindfulness to middle schoolers in Los Angeles. And and I used to have these students who were considered bullies, but I mean, they were just people, they were just suffering and looking for a place to belong. And sometimes they would come to my clubs and try to get kicked out. They were such good teachers of mine. And I always had them come on in, and yet I had these little tender sixth graders with these like really kind of violent eighth graders, and like the clash of that and trying to like protect these sixth graders, but at the same time, like wanting them to be strong so that I can really lean in and love these wounded eighth graders. And then at the same time, there's me and there's my heart, and I have to care for this heart. Otherwise, I'm not good for anybody if I come undone. And I just remember, you know, telling them whenever they would, put down the sixth graders or say something to me, or, I would just say, I can't let you speak that way to them. But here's the thing, I'll never let someone speak that way to you.
Hmm.
And it always made so much sense, just like this goes for everyone. Like I'm gonna protect this person here, but I'm also gonna protect you. And I get to protect myself too. Let's try again tomorrow. Come back. So that kind of like boundary of like, you know, that we don't treat each other that way, but I care about you. And this is how I get to show you that I care about you, is how I care about this vulnerable sixth grader, or how I care for myself. But that framing of it was a teacher to myself, and I'm just so grateful for these students.
Yeah.
Yeah, for many reasons. And also, I mean, we were pretty much teaching the Brahma Viharas, and compassion, equanimity, loving kindness, appreciative joy. And we'd ask like, well, what's an example of compassion? And these same kind of wounded eighth graders could only frame things kind of in a double negative, like, you know, don't hit anyone, don't uh don't be violent. Don't, it's like it just really pulled at my heart. Like they were so the environment that they were coming from was just such a violent environment that they couldn't even frame things in the positive.
Yeah.
But the true um but they were there. Like they really cared in that moment. They were really participating. And those days really, those moments really felt like wins to me. but I got a lot of insight from it too. And thank you for letting me share that.
Yeah, beautiful sharing, Amy. And thanks to you and Kathy Lynn for sharing with us. We should probably wrap up. I'll just make a couple of announcements. I'll be leading a day-long retreat this Saturday, both on Zoom and in person, 9:30 to 4, the 22nd. And there's a half-day retreat on the 5th of April that I'll be leading. On the 29th, 3 community teachers will be leading community support in times of stress and uncertainty, 10 to 12 on the 29th. And there's a new community group forming for spiritual friendship. It's just going to be on Zoom. It's starting, I believe, in April, facilitated by Ryan and Shelley. And they're looking for people to join. It will be a small group. I think it's going to meet twice a month. We'll have more details soon, but look for that or send an email to the center if you might be interested in a spiritual friendship group, just to have some closer Dharma friends. It's really important if you don't have a close or more than one close Dharma friend to find ways to cultivate a close friend that is as into the practice as you are. It's kind of a basic requisite if you can do it. So keep that in mind. So good to see everybody. Thanks for coming tonight. Feel free to take a moment if you want to just unmute yourself and say good